Hey guys, what I'm doing right now is called supply preaching, in case you don't know. I'm stepping in for somebody else. Other people might call it substitute preaching. But in seminary, there was always kind of a running joke that whenever you supply preach, anything that would possibly go wrong does. I kind of knew this whenever I was a kid, because whenever my father would go around and supply preach, one time I spilled grape knee-high on him. And he had to preach with a white shirt with a nice big purple stain going across his chest. Well, for me and Amber, we are not an exception to the rule this week. So Monday morning, not Monday morning, Thursday morning, I came into the church and Judy informed me that the internet wasn't working. So I was running around to everything that we had that was networked, trying to reboot it, check connections and everything else. Nothing was working. Then I got a call from my wife, and this happened. That's my electrical box on the side of my garage. Amber and I were having our driveway redone, and the dump truck didn't look above it when it was dumping the gravel. So that happened. Yay. But we still had electricity. It didn't actually pull the power, so we still had power. So I drive back home really quick. I snap some pictures of all the damage, and I come back to the church. Judy informs me that the Comcast Verizon monstrosity was what was causing the internet problems. So I try to call Amber to check and see if we have internet at the house, but my phone wouldn't work because I have Verizon. So after work was done, I drive home because apparently Snowpocalypse 2018 was about ready to hit. Amber and I had to go to the grocery store to get milk, eggs, and bread because you cannot survive 3 flakes of snow without milk, eggs, and bread. So by the time we get back to our house, P&M had so graciously come by and cut our power for our safety. So Amber and I get back out as the snow's just about ready, starting to fall, and we find somewhere that has Wi-Fi, and I download an app to enable Wi-Fi calling on my phone. I called a lot of you guys. Either you had Verizon too and your phone wasn't working, you were out of town, or you saw the telephone number that was different and you're like, I don't know who that is. So Amber and I spent the night in our house on Thursday night with no power. Fortunately, we have a fireplace and we have a heat buddy, so we did have heat, but we had no electricity. Friday morning, the people that caused this little debacle brought a diesel generator over to our house, which is great. Now we have electricity for about half of our house, but now we have a constant brrrr from a diesel generator going on outside the entire time, which is great. Then we requested for our electrician to get the electricity on as soon as he possibly could. So he made a call, and P&M came by our house at the wonderful time of 2 a.m. last night. To reattach our electricity. It's been a fun weekend. So, we're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, I think it's an appropriate scripture, seeing as how we're about ready to change over to a new year. Now, Ecclesiastes is often a misunderstood book. A lot of people think it's depressing. I actually made a joke about that in the last time I preached here. But again, that's what it was. It was just a joke. But a lot of people legitimately feel that way about this book. I think it's a misunderstanding of what the book's trying to do, but I think a lot of the times people compare it with Proverbs. It's another wisdom book. It's right beside one another, both written by Solomon. And the two books have very different takes on its perspective. You see, Proverbs starts out in the very first chapter, and it identifies the very beginning of the book says that wisdom starts with the fear of God. Wisdom starts by God's perspective, seeing everything from a heaven-down point of view. Kind of like looking out the window of an airplane whenever you're flying by. Your problems get put into perspective really well whenever you're seeing things from God's point of view. Matter of fact, a Prius and a semi look a lot alike at 30,000 feet. But Ecclesiastes takes a completely different point of view. It starts on the ground, in the dirt. All of your problems are life-size, huge, right in front of you. And also, the only hints of hope that are scattered throughout the book are whenever the writer looks up to God, looks up to heaven, and realizes that is the only hope that we have. You see, for a long time, for a lot of people, you don't really understand why anyone would read this book. And I think that is an all too common perspective that we have. You see, there are a lot of us that come to Christ at a young age. We realize that our only hope is from heaven. But there's also a lot of people in the church that will, and a whole lot of people outside of the church, that look for hope absolutely anywhere else they possibly can find it, and look to heaven absolutely last. We search through absolutely everywhere on this planet, turning over every stone, trying to find hope, trying to find anything on this planet that will give us the hope that we need, and it's just not here. Whenever we're looking for hope in that way, we can throw up our hands a lot of the times and say, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. But then, every once in a while, when we get a glimpse from heaven about what true hope really is, it's like a drowning man being able to stick his head above the water for just a moment to catch breath. It's a beautiful thing, and we have to hold on to that. We have to grasp on to the hope from heaven and who that hope points us to. So, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we're going to go 1 through 13, but we're going to start out right now 1 through 8. For there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what was planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. I really don't like the breakdown part of that verse right now. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to speak and a time to seek and a time to loose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Please pray with me. Father God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much that we can come to it and we can draw wisdom, we can draw hope from what you had to teach us. Let this word change our lives. Let this word illuminate our path before us. It's in your name. Amen. So, first key point for the sermon is things change. This is one of the truths that is presented in Scripture that very few people argue with. But half of the time, we don't like that things change. If things are going good for us, we don't want things to change. But the good news is that if things are not going good for you, things change too. But one of the most difficult parts of this change is realizing that sometimes the right thing to do is dictated by the circumstances. You see, there's nothing wrong with Facebook. But getting on Facebook during the middle of a church service, probably not a good thing to do. By the way, whenever I'm up on the bridge, I can totally see everybody who's on Facebook in the room. There's nothing wrong with fire, as long as it's in a fireplace. You set it in the middle of your living room floor, you might have a problem. There's nothing wrong with hitting somebody whenever you're in a boxing class. However, hitting someone out of anger, there is a problem with that, even when they're family. There's nothing wrong with talking, but there's something wrong with malicious words and gossip. There's nothing wrong with sex, as long as it's in the confines of marriage. There's nothing wrong with fireworks. But to whichever of my neighbors this applies to, there is something wrong with fireworks at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm a little bit bitter about that one. You see, there's a weird thing that relationships also have a season too. And everyone's been around a new parent that just had a new baby, and they're chasing you around with their phone, and they're showing you 200 pictures of every single time their baby is eaten, every time their baby slept, every time their baby's crawled, rolled over, everything else like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. You amuse them, you smile. Of course, they think they have the cutest baby on the planet. But what if that wasn't a season in their life? What if someone was chasing you around with a phone showing you 200 pictures of the eating, walking, and sleeping of their 20-year-old? That'd just be weird. Even marriages have seasons. The last time that I was truly taken back by this was the summer before Amber and I moved out here. You see, we went up to Niagara Falls, but before I tell that story, I have to tell a different story in order for it to make sense. You see, when Amber and I had just been married a year, we went up to Newport, Kentucky, which is just across the river from Cincinnati, on the 4th of July to watch their fireworks. And it was crowded. There were people everywhere. And Amber and I were trying to snake our way through the crowd to get into a restaurant to, get a bite to eat. And a young lady approached me, who obviously did not see Amber, and told me that there was a place at her table for myself. And before I could say a word, my wife jumped around me, got her finger in this woman's face, and said, "Listen here, Barbie. You have no right to be talking to some other woman's husband." The fear on this woman's face cannot be overemphasized. Her life flashed before her eyes. She saw the light at the end of the tunnel. I loved it. Anyway, I told you that story to tell you this one. The summer before we got here, Amber and I went to Niagara Falls. And whenever you go to Niagara Falls, you have to go on the Maid of the Mist. The Maid of the Mist is a little boat that trolleys around underneath at the bottom of the waterfall so you can see it and you can get sprayed with all the water and everything. It's supposed to be one of the most romantic things you can do on the planet. So Amber and I show up early. We get a spot to stand up next to the railing, and the boat starts, trolleying around in the river, and it's breathtaking. It's amazing. So I wrap my arms around my wife, and I grab a hold of the railing in front of us, and I just take a few seconds to think about the last wonderful 10 years of our marriage. And I look down, and I see 6 hands instead of the 4 that I'm supposed to see. A 5'0" 90-pound girl has wrapped her hands around my arm and is leaning her head over on my shoulder. I try not to make a big deal of it because if you remember the first story, I've watched a lot of America's Most Wanted. This seems like the perfect beginning to one of their stories. So, I wait for a few seconds, and my wife begins to tremble. I thought that she was going to pick this little girl up and throw her over the railing of the boat. We wait a few seconds and nothing happens. And then I realize my wife isn't trembling because she's angry. She's trembling because she's cackling, laughing so hard. So there is a season, turn. After 10 years of marriage, my wife knew exactly what I was going to do. The reassurance that she had had for the past 10 years of our marriage, changed her reaction to where he could laugh about that kind of thing. And right now, whenever Amber talks about that encounter, she mainly talks about how uncomfortable I was. So, like a marriage, your relationship with God has seasons too. There will be times in your faith when all that gets you through the day is your faith in God. His strength that he gave you is all you have. There will also be times when you just constantly dive into Scripture. You're constantly in prayer because that's all you desire at that moment. You're constantly learning new things and you have a renewed passion. There will also be times when you don't want to go to God with anything because you've done something stupid. And you know that if you go before him, he's going to push you in the direction of righteousness. And maybe that's not what you want to do at the moment. There will also be times when you realize that you have followed God so closely for so long that your will and his have been so intertwined that they're inseparable. Those moments are amazing. That's kind of the goal that we're hoping to get everybody to eventually. Back in our text, verse 9 through 13. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. I perceived that there is nothing better from them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in his toil. This is God's gift to man. Your work is a blessing from God. Everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in his toil or in his work. This is God's gift to man. I think this passage has pointed us to something that we've forgotten in the church, that work itself is a gift. And I knew as soon as I wrote that there would be a few of you that would think, can I return that gift? You see, in this church, we've talked about blessings. We've talked about the blessing of marriage. We've talked about the blessing of family. We've talked about the blessing of God's correction. We've talked about the blessing of community. But when was the last time you really expressed thanks to God for work? Before I started as a pastor, I was a job coach for individuals with special needs. And whenever I would take these people out and they would work for a living, even though they had severe disabilities, they had a pride, they had a confidence in themselves that the other people that I worked with didn't have. That was, even though they didn't know it, that was a blessing from God. That was a gift. Your work should be a source of fulfillment, but not your only source of fulfillment. Your work is not just about money, and it should definitely not be a false idol in your life. It should not be where you draw your identity, but it should be another opportunity for you to find satisfaction and fulfillment. You see, chapter 3, verse 22 of Ecclesiastes says that there is nothing better than for a man to rejoice in his work. How much differently would your job be if every morning you got up and you say, God, I am going to get the gift that you're giving me, and I'm going to squeeze every last divine drop out of it. You see, where I come from, there's a special place of honor put up for people that are going into the ministry. Yeah. There's kind of a ladder of hierarchy with it. Youth ministers are at the bottom. Children's ministers and music ministers are next up. Pastors are over that. And way up at the top, overseas missionaries. Ah. They were the crown jewel of the culture back in Kentucky. And there's a couple of verses in the letters of Paul that kind of justify that in a very small way, nowhere near as far as it went. But there was also a passage that changed my perspective on work entirely. You see, in the beginning of the book of Matthew, Jesus had been fasting for 40 days. He was wandering in the wilderness, and he was being tempted by Satan. Spoiler, he doesn't fall into sin. He resists the temptation, so everything's good. But in Matthew 4, verse 11, it says, "The devil left him, and behold, the angels came and were ministering to him." Ministering? To him? To Jesus? You see, in the way that I thought things, ministering to someone was to tell them about Jesus. How in the world do you tell Jesus about Jesus? That don't make no sense. It's like the angel would come down and say, "Hey, Jesus, have you heard about Jesus? Because whenever you give your life to Jesus, your life will never be the same again." That makes no sense. You see, the word ministering does not mean anything that is only happens in these walls. The word minister means to help. So whenever I was preaching my father's ordination service for Central Baptist in Lewisport, Kentucky, I talked about how my big little brother, who is a firefighter and EMT, ministered to people in what he did. And someone after the service came up to me and asked if he was serving at a church somewhere. And I said, well, he serves God, but he does it by pulling people from twisted pieces of steel and by helping people whenever they're at their absolute most desperate. You see, ministering is not something that happens only in these walls. Ministering happens every time we take seriously Matthew 25, when it says that everything that we do for the least of these, we do to God himself. So our jobs, our work, every time we encounter someone else is an opportunity for us to minister, to help someone else, both with our actions and with our words. However, sometimes your job might not necessarily seem like you're helping anyone. You might dread getting up every morning and going to work. Here's the reassurance from this passage. It's a season. It will change. Just remember to take care of your family, take care of yourself, and also remember that you don't know what God's at work doing right now. Next key point, your time is coming, but in a good way. Most of the time when people say that, they mean that your number's up, you're about ready to kick the bucket. So, your time's coming, but in a good way. In verse 11, he says, it says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in the man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end." Whenever it says everything has been made beautiful in its own time, a lot of your translations will read everything is made useful or appropriate in its own time. It kind of means that whenever something works, and it works beautifully. That applies to you too. God is at work on you, crafting you, placing you in the right time in your life. You just don't know what he's doing most of the time until it's over. God has put eternity into man's heart. God has made mankind in a unique way in that we pursue knowledge, we pursue so much depth in the world, even though we know that for every question we have answered, 3 more will pop up. God has put a longing within us that we need to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. Why? Why is it that we long to be a part of something that is more than us? C.S. Lewis put it this way, that God has put a hunger for the eternal within us. That hunger for the eternal will not be satisfied until we get a relationship with the eternal one, God himself. St. Augustine said it this way, that my heart is restless until it finds rest in God. You see, we're going to jump to the book of Esther really quick. To set the backstory behind this passage, the Jews are facing extermination at this point. The Babylonians are about ready to just kill them all. And Mordecai, Esther's only living relative, comes up to her and says that she needs to talk to the king as soon as possible. But then Mordecai says this in chapter 4, verse 14. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Who knows? Whenever you read this book, it is clear that that is what God is up to. It is clear that God has put Esther in this place. She was one amongst millions that was picked to marry the king. She was in the one place that she needed to be when the Jews needed them the absolute most. But whenever the time came for her to speak up for the Jewish nation, she was there. Of course that's what God had in mind, but she didn't know it at the time. Neither did Mordecai. None of us know this. We have eternity in our hearts, but we cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Like Esther, we don't always see what God's up to. To recap, everything changes, and there's a time and a place for almost everything. That your work is a gift of God, that everything you do is an encounter and an opportunity to minister to those around you. And 3, your time is coming. God is lovingly crafting you for a reason, for a purpose. But we don't know it because we're too small. You see, I don't know why you're here this morning. You might not know why you're here either. But if you've never given your heart to Jesus, I know that there's something inside of you. I know that there's something inside of you that draws you to think about what happens whenever you die. Something that makes you long to be a part of something much bigger than yourself. Something that makes you long for a relationship that none of the relationships that you have will fit. You see, that longing in your heart is a hunger that God put there, and that only he can satisfy. That's why we're here. We are here to connect people to God. In just a minute, I'm going to pray. And whenever I say amen, Kevin is going to come up here, and he's going to begin to sing. The altar will be open, and I will be here waiting. If you are too scared to come up here by yourself, grab someone around you. If you need somebody to pray with you, I'll be here. If you can't make it this far up the aisle, stop halfway and wave at me. I'll come to you. The altar will be open. That relationship with God, that hole that you have, that void, that hunger, can only be satisfied with Jesus. And that's what's offered here today. Let's pray.